It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Alabama and Georgia effectively ban abortion in their states, Manchester City winning the Premier League, and the ANC victorious in the South African elections, albeit with a significantly reduced majority. But we are here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Arion, McNicoll and Hollie, Clemence, and making her Week Unwrapped debut from theweek.com, our American cousins, it is Jessica Hullinger. Hello, Jessica.
Hello, Ollie.
Hi, you get to go first.
Excellent.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week will be remembered for misguided moonshots.
As you know, the president has given our agency the bold charge to land the next man and the first woman on the lunar South Pole by 2024. And now President Trump has extended his vote of confidence in our work with an amended budget request for fiscal year 2020. It includes $1.6 billion in additional funding.
That was NASA Administrator Jim Burdenstein speaking on Tuesday. So, Jess, are we, the Americans, really going back to the moon?
My guess is probably not. So what has happened is NASA has asked Congress for basically more money. So its annual budget is something like $20 billion, and it wants to add $1 billion to that in order to send someone back to the moon. Specifically, they want to send a woman to the moon this time, is what they say. And they want to do this within the next 5 years. Trump obviously is very on board with this.
Why obviously? Just because Make America Great Again, nostalgia, Kennedy?
Yeah. I mean, so on Monday, Trump said in a tweet, "Under my administration, we are restoring NASA to greatness." So I think this idea of going back to the moon, is sort of within the ethos of making America great again. So I think people feel very nostalgic about the greatness that sort of came along with America being the first to land on the moon and put someone on the moon.
But there are surveys of the American public and their views on this. And although in what I've read, the US population seem keen on NASA being a state-administered body and America representing America's interests in the new space frontier, against private companies and other governments, there isn't that much enthusiasm for going back to the moon. There's a feeling that we've done the moon. No,
that's exactly right. So, in fact, a Pew study showed that only 13% of Americans think that the first priority for NASA should be sending us back to the moon. There are many other priorities that people think that we should look at. So, for example, they want NASA to be looking at asteroid defense. They find that very compelling and very interesting and arguably more pertinent to American survival on Earth. But they also think that NASA should be focusing on climate observation.
But, Arion, NASA is saying essentially with this moon mission, this isn't really about just getting to the moon. This is about going from the moon to Mars. We can enable all our other technological achievements by going first back to the moon.
That's right. And I think that they see the moon as a potential stopping point because of a number of things. Technological advance since the 60s generally, but also the discovery of water on the surface of the moon, which can be harnessed in various kinds of ways, not only to potentially support a station up there, but also to turn the components of water into fuels for rockets that you can then send on their way further and go see Mars.
There's a cynicism nowadays, though, isn't there, Holly, about this kind of thing, I reckon, amongst the general public. When you hear that a space agency wants to harness fuel on the moon, it has a different tone, perhaps, than it would have done in the 60s. You kind of think, haven't we made enough of a balls up of Earth without taking the fuel from the moon?
It's a strange paradox that Trump's kind of eager to look outside the Earth and isn't willing to look at the truth of what will actually happen to the Earth. And that seems to be what that study says. People want to look at climate change rather than this magical, let's go into the moon and see space, which is kind of this extra amazing thing that scientists need to do. But maybe we should look at ourselves first, like you say.
And Trump's actually taken money out of the budget NASA had to look into climate change.
Yeah, so that's one of the main criticisms. One of the questions is, where will this money come from for this new budget? And yes, he's he's seeking steep cuts in science research at other agencies, including the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and of course the Department of Energy. So that's quite concerning.
Also, it seems like if the total NASA budget, which has, and NASA has been saying that it's been underfunded for years, if not decades. If the total NASA budget is $20 billion per year and Trump's talking about adding an extra $1 billion and mounting another moon mission, that just seems like massively too little money, right?
It's paltry. And also, NASA has called this a, quote, down payment. So I don't think that there's any secret about the fact that this is not going to be nearly enough money, which raises the question of whether or not it will actually happen. And I would argue probably it will not. This isn't the first time that a president has launched a mission to send NASA back to the moon. President George Bush did this in 2004, and NASA spent $9 billion trying to get us back on the moon, and then Obama came along and ditched the plan. And so it was wasted money.
And I wonder if they're just sort of biting their tongue and swallowing their pride a little bit. If you ask the scientists who work for NASA what was the priority, they'd probably agree with the American public, wouldn't they, that lunar missions aren't, but they're catering this new plan to the president.
I hate to bring China back into it, but I will.
You're on the Week Unwrapped. It's mandatory.
China's aiming for the moon as well, and I wonder if that's kind of galvanised Trump to get back into a space race, perhaps with China. There's lots of other countries looking to the moon. Whether people, again, that survey said people wanted to look more into the moon, into space, but not necessarily put people on the moon. That's another question, whether we should be putting robotics and using other techniques to find all these new innovations rather than using people, which puts a big toll on human bodies and isn't necessarily the best use of funding.
And we have private companies now as well, don't we? SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, which is essentially tourism, but nonetheless putting rockets up there. What is the role that NASA should be playing in that environment? Because in a weird sort of way, it's as American, isn't it, to have private enterprise going up there and doing this stuff as it is having a state-funded operation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that NASA has for a long time probably felt a bit threatened by the rise of private companies aiming for the moon and beyond. I think there's this idea that NASA would work with these private companies and they would provide some of the craft and the technology to send people to the moon. What role should NASA play? That's a good question. And I think NASA is having a bit of a crisis about that itself.
And also, why have a government agency at all in the world of the International Space Station? The whole point is supposed to be international cooperation.
They do say it's kind of a co-petition. There's competition and cooperation between different countries and private companies. But I guess we've got to look at how you'd carve up the moon if it does turn out to be a money-making enterprise. Like Arion was talking about the helium-3, that they're talking about a potential fuel for nuclear fusion. If another country gets that first, is it necessarily theirs, or do you have to split it with the countries that have helped them get there? How we work that out will be an interesting question for the future.
And I think that there's so much regulation still to be done on space exploration and space exploitation that, as we've spoken about on this podcast before, space is still largely regulated by this 1966 treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. And, the UN has tried to make further legislation to try to govern the ways that we use things that we discover in space. But it's been really unsuccessful, largely because the US continues to stand in the way of these treaties as they get mounted. But you sort of wonder whether the involvement of a national agency has half an eye on the fact that there's valuable elements and valuable substances up there to be exploited.
I wonder if we just park our cynicism for a moment as well and take NASA's announcement at face value. When you go on their website and they kind of talk about the values they want to achieve by going back to the moon and rebooting this space program, I think the first thing they mention is inspiration. And there is something in that, isn't there? As a kid who found, frankly, physics and chemistry very dull, the only thing that got me excited about those subjects was space. And maybe there is a role for the government to inspire children to become scientists, whether or not they get to the moon.
I do, however, wonder whether we need to send people up into space anymore. I don't know that inspiration and, sort of passionate waxing about human, destiny is a good enough reason to spend all of the money that would be spent on sending people into space and specifically to the moon. But I also think that NASA, it needs human stories in order to get people to believe in it. It's more difficult to become inspired by a robot roaming around Mars, right? Even though it's arguable that a robot would be better at collecting data, it would be easier to send it, much cheaper to send it there. But it's hard to get people behind that idea. human stories are much more inspiring.
And I think that's true, that all of this research and all of this money may be being put to absolutely no good end at all if we discover, as seems to be the indication, we've only ever put humans in space for about a year at a time, and it seems that the pressures that it puts on the human body suggest that actually we are very ill-equipped for surviving in space. So we could spend all this money, try and get to Mars, and then realize that actually humans really cannot live anywhere except Earth, at least for the time being, at least until our technology progresses massively. So inspiration, yes, but it's got to be being put to an actual legitimate end, otherwise it's pointless.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you'll find that sending Bruce Willis into space actually averted Armageddon. So I've seen the film, so I'm pretty sure about that. Arion, you're up next after this. Arion, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
A silent killer from the US now appears to have arrived in the UK.
You used the term deaths of despair. Did you guys coin that?
Yeah.
The addiction thing is so close to suicide. Some of the opioid doctors talk about a lost generation.
One of the things that intrigues the researchers is that it seems to be a North American phenomenon.
This is where the comparison with Europe is very important, because you don't really see deaths of despair.
Though in Southern Europe, you do see really high unemployment, particularly for young people.
We're not talking about unemployment here. It's much more to do with these, things that you would correlate with a spiritual crisis.
That was the Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton, so a different one, talking to the Wall Street Journal's Jason Bellini in 2018. Arion, then you were hearing that this idea of deaths of despair was a US problem. Is it still?
No, and that's the news from this week. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, a UK-based think tank, found that these deaths of despair, which is a sort of loose term that captures suicide and drug and alcohol overdoses, appears to have started to show the sorts of uplift that it was showing when Angus Deaton and his partner Anne Case, both from Princeton, were identifying a couple of years ago in the US. And they were looking at stats that had started around the early 90s, and they found that these kinds of deaths were on the rise pretty much consistently since then across America. And now in looking at the UK, Deaton has found that a similar trend is identifiable here.
Is this the same story about male mental health that we hear a lot, that the biggest killer of middle-aged men, I think, is self-harm or issues related to that? Is this the same sort of set of stats?
Interestingly, in the States, the disparity between men and women was much higher. But over here, while there still is a gap, it's a smaller gap. And the trend is consistent across the genders. So no, actually, this isn't a male-based phenomenon.
So why has there been a rise then?
So they identify several things. Similar to the US, there's this deterioration of job prospects and increases in poverty. But then within the US, there's also been this massive rise in opioid addiction, that there's been a little bit of a rise in opioid addiction here, but nothing comparable to the US. So the other thing that they identify across both countries are these sort of social changes. And particularly, they say, in a sort of slightly moralizing sounding way, that the breakdown of marriage and the diminishing communities based on people's sort of decrease in belief may also be leading to the kinds of isolation that can lead people to these sorts of deaths.
But Hollie, other things used to kill people in middle age that maybe aren't now because of medical progress. I mean, obviously it's not a good idea. Obviously it's not a positive story that more people are dying through alcohol poisoning, but it might be that those people might have died of cancer before and now they're dying of alcoholism instead.
Yeah, it's a separate issue, but like you say, that's true. I think cancer deaths were reduced, which maybe makes this look more stark because it's increasing. You feel like all deaths should be decreasing because of that, but actually this stat stands out because it's going the opposite direction. It happens to come out the same week that Office for National Statistics report about life satisfaction that came out on Wednesday, suggesting that the most important things to us are marital status, self-reported health and economic activity. It kind of ties in, and it's like a big spiral, I think, for these people that have not got job security. that's affecting their marriage, then that's affecting their health, and it's just one big kind of spiral into, as you say, deaths of despair.
But for politicians, Jess, how should they react to this? You know, if you ideologically believe that austerity is the best way to recover the budget of the country, would you really take data, even if it could be proven that an increase in suicides is caused partly by austerity cuts? Would you really take that data and say, right, well, we won't do it then?
Yeah, that's tricky. I think it depends. I think it depends on how much you believe that the data links specifically to austerity. I mean, I think that there's an amazing quote that I found by Peter Goodman in the New York Times, who wrote last year that austerity has made British society less like the rest of Western Europe in its generous social safety nets and egalitarian ethos, and more like the United States, where millions lack healthcare and job loss can set off a precipitous plunge in fortunes. I mean, I think, you mentioned this started in the U.S. As someone who hails from the U.S., I can tell you there's a strong sense that if something happens to you, you will be lost. It's very easy to fall through the cracks in the U.S. There's a lack of a sense of sort of community and support, and I think that that's huge when people are losing their jobs. Healthcare obviously is a huge issue as well.
I mean, it's not just a sense, is it? It's a reality that you might be able to get some philanthropy, but if there isn't a charity that's willing to help you, you are on you. There isn't a government safety net for you. That's
absolutely right, yeah. It's a very scary thing. And I think also what's interesting about this research is it talks about community and the necessity for community and how humans really need to feel part of a group. And, we are seeing increasing isolation. We're on our phones all the time. Marriage rates in the UK are falling. More than half of people in the UK now say they are non-religious. So the traditional sort of community sense that we used to find is falling apart a bit.
And it's interesting, isn't it, Arion, that this seems to also coincide with a much increased awareness of mental health. I mean, there's constant campaigns about being aware about people's mental health. You can't move for celebrity memoirs of people being open about their own personal struggles and depression. That's sort of primetime TV fodder now. It's one thing being aware of it. It's another thing to actually find someone to talk to and someone that can help you.
I think that's right. And I think that particularly dependence and addiction type mental health problems are things that we're really not very good at treating. And so even if you can identify someone as suffering from a drug addiction or having alcohol dependency, it's really hard to know how to help them, particularly if their addiction has precipitated the end of some of their other social connections, because actually the feeling is that the more people you have around you, the better chance you have of getting out of those situations. But that's the thing that tends to peel away first. So I think that you're right, that it's a particular type of mental health problem that we're talking about, and the treatment is not straightforward.
And in terms of the world of work, I mean, men in particular, middle-aged men sort of defining themselves by their job and then not having a job. Where does that tie in with the kind of story we've discussed many times on this show, which is the robots are coming, AI and all the rest of it?
Well, there was this really interesting piece of research by another Princeton scientist who was suggesting fairly loosely in a way that the solution could be that the restoration of blue-collar jobs may just look different, that no longer will it be working in factories and manual labour, but the future of blue-collar work could be basic coding. And if you can teach people those sorts of skills, then in a high-tech world, that will be the equivalent of a factory line. And I just thought that was a really interesting suggestion for this particular problem, where, often you hear the problem pointed out, but you don't hear people going, well, how about we give this a crack?
And we talk on this show about long-term trends, things that might have an impact on our lives in the years moving forward. Holly, do you think these statistics are going to continue to accelerate?
I don't think it will just turn around very quickly. If it is linked to austerity, obviously we need to take time to get over the austerity. We might be kind of moving out of it, but I think it will take years, or indeed a change of government, where, Labour keep promising things that will increase welfare for people, whether that works or not. I think it will take a long time before you see a backward change in the statistics.
And what is the discussion like in the US about this, Jess? It has been more of an established reality there for longer.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it is kind of an established reality. It took me moving to the UK to really see the serious deficits of the US health system and the US sort of social care system. I think that it is not nearly as it's not taken as seriously as it should be. I think it's sort of seen as a a fact of life, which is really unfortunate. I mean, obviously, the opioid crisis is getting some attention, and I think we're hopefully making strides there. But I think just generally, as a trend, the sort of social safety net and this idea that people are really despairing, unfortunately, I think it's here to stay for now.
Well, if you've been affected by this issue, do bear with me whilst I just give out some numbers. The Samaritans can always be contacted on 116 123 here in the UK. In the US, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 1-800-273-8255. And if you're listening in Australia, the crisis support service Lifeline is on 13 11 14. One last story to come after this. And so finally this week is Hollie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is the latest therapy craze a touch too much?
Genesis started this business because she believes everyone should have someone to cuddle with.
With something like this, you get someone to listen to you and you get someone to hug you if you need it.
An activity she says is scientifically proven to release oxytocin, a powerful chemical in your brain.
It helps battle depression, release stress, anxiety.
So how is a service like this assuring you're safe?
It's strict rules that they have to follow. I mean, they're agreeing to, like, this is non-sexual whatsoever.
Each customer is required to fill out a waiver and pass a consultation, agreeing the session is strictly platonic. As for cuddlers, they're all given background checks.
But it's for the safety of them and the safety of the cuddler.
Genesis Burrows speaking to ABC7 earlier this week. Hollie, professional cuddlers. This is your story of the week with implications for all our lives, yes?
Yes. So
local news story from Fort Myers. Why is that?
So you heard there that's a new business opening up in Florida offering professional cuddling services, but it's not just this one. They seem to be popping up across the US and also the UK.
Do they?
And it's the latest therapy, but it struck me that the nature of it it's at odds with this Me Too movement that's going forward. I feel like everyone's probably afraid of touching anyone at the moment because of the Me Too movement, which is fine with me. But there seems to be all the therapists that you listen to or you read about that promote this cuddling therapy say we're really lacking in touch. And that's what humans are missing. Going back to our last story, it's probably why people are feeling depressed and they've got anxiety and loneliness. We need more touching in our lives, and they've turned it into a business.
So platonic cuddling actually could be a solution to a real problem.
It could if you feel
She's
comfortable
smiling.
with this.
You're not convinced, are you?
I feel very British about it in that I don't want anyone touching me. I just think there's something deep-rooted about cuddling that it needs to be with somebody that you are friends or family with, and to do it with a random stranger that you're paying just feels
$5 an hour.
Yes, you get a good money for it if you're willing to be a cuddler, but it doesn't feel right to me.
It's also the kind of cuddling that's up for grabs, Jess. I mean, on the one, I shouldn't have even said up for grabs, should I? The fact that it is spooning on a bed is one of the services that they offer. So you go to a room, there's a clean bed, you have to wear clean clothes, then someone who you're paying, how many dollars an hour did you say? $85 an hour, then spoons you from behind like in a familial, loving relationship. That isn't the same as just give me a $5 and I'll give you a hug, is it? That they say it's platonic, but you could see how that could easily lead to someone feeling the feelings of being in a sexual relationship with someone.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it seems quite intimate, but I also wonder if maybe that's what's needed for some people. You know, you mentioned the Me Too movement. I actually think that this is an interesting development if we're going to connect it to the Me Too movement. You know, a lot of men in particular have said, what do I need to do around women? What's okay? Is it okay to hug? Do I need to get specific consent in writing? Do I need to be on camera? So you ask these questions, and actually this is saying we can cuddle, we can, we can be close and get all whatever benefits that come with that, but there are rules, very specific rules.
These people aren't colleagues, are they?
And they're not colleagues, that's right. So it's a transaction. So it actually, I think it's interesting that it does put into place these very interesting rules that men have said, do I need to have these in order to have safe engagement with other people?
But also it's not just a gendered question, the diminishing of touch in the modern world. I remember a couple of years ago I was traveling in Tunisia and was on a train, and the train inspector came around, and a guy let his kid hand the tickets to the train inspector. And the inspector swept the kid up in his arms and gave him a kiss on both cheeks, had a look at the tickets, put him back down. This was a guy who he didn't know at all, and that would never fly in sort of contemporary Britain or Australia or the US, or anywhere else. There's lots of places where you couldn't do that anymore. And I think that this story about trying to reestablish some sort of places where you can touch in a way that is sort of sanctioned and okay is interesting. And yet you sort of wonder whether, I don't know, it just sort of feels like there's something underlying that's a little bit creepy about paying for it that is sort of contrary to what the person, the huggee, needs in the first place, which is some sort of intimacy that's real intimacy. It just feels like it's the opposite of that.
I think that's the problem, from what you get from a hug with a friend or a family member is also that feeling that they're there for you and that you've got this connection with them, whereas with a stranger, it just seems really superficial. But I've been really questioning my uptightness about this because I feel like it's wrong, but it's obviously not wrong. And I read a lot of reviews of people that had been to see one particular lady in London, and they did seem like actually transformed by it. Like they'd been for a lovely experience and they felt peaceful within themselves. I was thinking maybe I should go, but I'm not ready.
What was their prognosis? I mean, why were they lonely? Why were they sad? Why did they need a hug?
I think a lot of people were in London maybe travelling, or they'd split up with their partners.
Lots of people were in London. How damaging is that?
I mean, London itself, we've talked about it before, it is a lonely place, I think. But also, I thought I would go for a massage and I'd take my clothes off and let someone touch me in that way and pay for it. And is there that much difference? Maybe a cuddle's even less sinister than having someone cuddle you. And maybe when massage first came in as a therapy, there were probably all these questions and people feeling like it was taboo, and actually it's just fine.
I mean, there's cultural routine around massage, isn't there, Jess? You get the robe, you get the funny pants, you have the funny whale music on, you feel like this is a thing, this is a routine, whereas with cuddling, it's all new.
Exactly, and I think it feels a little bit icky, right? But I actually think that it will take off. I really do. I think it sort of ties into this sort of idea of loneliness that we were talking about in the last story, and this idea of needing to be around other people. And she mentions, all these sort of feel-good hormones that are released when you cuddle and when you're touched and sort of groomed. It's sort of evolutionary almost. It's in our DNA that we need to be touched. Not everyone, but a lot of people do. So I think that it could become more mainstream.
It's interesting, the comparison with massage, because there's probably some people that have massage that sort of wish that it was done with emotion, if you know what I mean, rather than they're paying for a completely cold and clinical touching, if you like. And equally, there are probably people who see sex workers who don't want sex, just want someone to cuddle on the bed. And there's probably people who see therapists who don't want someone to talk to. They want someone, or they wish that the person they were talking to would also give them a cuddle. It's this kind of grey area in the middle where maybe there is an opening.
Yeah, and I think with massage, at least, it's a form of touch that is meant to be remedial in a way that's very obvious. You have a problem with your back. I am going to fix your back by touching you. Whereas I think
that's a serious breach of our professional relationship.
just give it a chance, Ali. Let's see how it goes. No, but I think that the problem with this hug as therapy idea is that there's so many different kinds of reasons that someone might need a hug, and you wonder to what extent it just doesn't feel like a targeted therapy if it is therapeutic. And I wonder whether you're still going to end up with lots of the underlying causes that led someone to require hugging in the first place. I know that all sounds absurd, but I think I just feel as though there's something weird about going to a place and getting someone to hug you as if it's going to just be this all-encompassing fix,
Are any of you naturally huggers in the office, with clear boundaries and permissions and everything else? Do you ever? Jess is really firmly shaking her head. Would you? So if you were upset, you wouldn't expect a colleague to offer a hug. You'd find that intimidating.
I wouldn't find it intimidating, but I also know that it is kind of awkward, and I don't want to put anyone else in a position where they would feel uncomfortable because they might think that I'm uncomfortable. I really like hugs. I'm a very physical person. But yeah, I mean, I also recognize that the office is not necessarily the place for that.
Would you offer a hug, though? Because that's the thing, because once you've offered it, you're then putting the person in a position where they might feel awkward to refuse it, and they might not want it.
I don't offer hugs in the office, no.
Hollie's laughing.
Because this literally happened last year. Not in my office. There's a cuddle and co-worker workshops, which are being run by team bonding organisation that was designed to promote bonding and stress relief for colleagues. So your office would go to a place and all cuddle each other in a tent, and that would make you feel better the next day. So it's already been done. But no, unless someone was in tears and they needed a cuddle, maybe I would.
I suppose if it's spontaneous, if it feels very spontaneous in reaction to an emotional thing, it is slightly different to we saw the situation with the Ted Baker scenario where people saying this is a hugging culture that's been imposed.
That does sound like a sort of separate situation, but I think that we've just all now been drilled, and I think rightly so, not to do touching at work because for all the obvious reasons. And I think that probably those lines just need to stay, regardless of whether you're a hugging type person or not, and whether, because I suppose what you're saying is that sometimes the personal and the professional blur in ways where someone just comes to work and they've got a personal issue, and your natural human response would be to want to give them a hug in that situation if you weren't co-workers. But I think the fact that you are co-workers changes that dynamic and necessarily makes hugging wrong, and that's why we don't do it. I
mean, I'm a freelancer, so if anyone wants a hug... No.
It'll be $85, please. Yeah. What is that in pounds?
I'll get my agent to invoice. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Holly Clemence, Arion McNicoll, and Jessica Hullinger. Not hugger. Allow The Week Unwrapped to hug your ears every week for free when you subscribe on your podcast app of choice. And don't forget, you can receive 6 issues of The Week magazine for £1 and a free Moleskine notebook. It's a hug in paper form if you go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producers Matt Hill and Chika Ayres at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week,